What's up guys, SkyKevin here, and today we're going over some new information for the very first blog post featuring the new AI system overhaul for Last Oasis. We'll also be seeing some new creatures as well. This will be a follow-up from the previous video I did, with some new information from Neon. So, let's get started. With this update, we open up some inner workings of what the dev blogs will actually entail. Neon's done a bit of the groundwork, which is excellent to see with specific mechanics on what exactly is going on. They mention that there's going to be technical jargon used in the descriptions, but to be honest, I think you guys watch these videos specifically for the extremely detailed technical jargon that we can get out of what they say. He also mentions here that they're going to be referencing tiers of mobs. This doesn't mean much right now, but roughly throughout the rest of the blog post, I have a strange feeling that the direction that they're looking to go with this game has a lot to do with Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. What a lot of people don't know is that initially the game had this kind of system already in mind for the early phases of development. This is why when spawning in weapons and armor on a private server, they actually already classify it as Tier 1, 2, and 3 gear, despite having traditional names when you're looking at the weapon or in the tech tree. Further, in custom servers, you can already see what they have for Tier 1, 2, and 3 ballistas, as well as crafting stations. If you've seen my previous video on some of the hidden assets of the game, you'll see that they have things like even more intricate stomping stations, which were essentially supposed to be a Tier 3 thing. Generally, you can then see that the walkers will likely follow this same pattern, which it kind of already has had as a separation between, say, a dinghy, falco, and titan walker. But now, I'm starting to believe that they'll actually enforce limits on these walkers in terms of stations to include stronger weapons and increased walker speed. All in all, they're looking at some way to make the Titan relevant again, which I am all for, along with all the other bigger walkers as well. For design and direction, the biggest thing to note in this section is the admission that as developers, they messed up. Generally speaking, when making a game, you have a hierarchical design in place so that as the development continues, you can make easy changes as well as scale up different parts of it at an increased pace. Let's say, for example, you have a new Rupu type to add to the game, so you want to use the base model, but then you need to give them a new weapon, like say a scythe. You have to create the new item model for it, attach it to the creature, animate it, give it damage numbers, hitboxes, speed, range, and even the weight and size of the Rupu itself can change. Or, instead of doing this manually, you can set up a system that always solves those factors, so you can essentially press a randomize button and have a stable Rupu every single time. In this case, when it came to the monsters that they did previously, the difference in code from a Nur to an Occam was likely completely different. Indeed, Rupus were the only mobs that were simple enough for them to create variations on them, and even then they only had around 10 or 11. So with this update, they're basically rebuilding the code behind the scenes so that instead of a bunch of text in a document that they have to edit by hand, they can just click a bar on a slider and increase something like the health or even physical size of the monster. Ultimately, the sustainability of it and the main reason games use a hierarchical design like this is so that, let's say in the future you have 30 different types of Rupus and you want to rebalance things by giving them all an extra 10% max HP. It's a simple change, but you're going to have to go through every single type of creature and change that max HP value, rather than having a single variable like, say, Rupu base health that you can then just add 10%, thus making every creature in the game or of that type feel the increase. This is a design benefit that makes one person able to do things like create a dungeon where mobs all deal 2 times as much damage, and they don't have to remake every single creature just to do it. They can add something like an overlying buff to all of them while you're in that instance, and essentially after that, it's like drag and drop game design. So it's good that they've taken these steps, but hopefully we can see some content and changes coming much faster than what we've seen these previous months. Moving on, hunting mobs are going to be a major part of the gameplay for Season 5. I don't really know what this entails just yet, but we'll get into my predictions for that a little later. They do mention that early on in the game, we'll start with Rupus and Femke of a smaller variety for the first walkers, which means they'll probably have the progression of the walkers linked to fighting these creatures. I'm not positive, but I'm pretty sure that means that the Firefly walkers will require something like Femke ears to be built, instead of just wood, stone, and fiber. Instead of meteor cores, you'll need to fight actually large mobs to get those materials to build the very large walkers. We then get into the extremely exciting concept of the wild monsters versus the new battle mobs. These are essentially going to be giant colossal creatures that players will need to fight with actual onboard weapons, rather than beat sticks and wingsuits. Indeed, I think the design concept for this is something where they thought, how can we introduce an NPC version of a walker battle, so that players can justify grouping up and farming on large walkers together as they take down large enemy ships, or in this case, moving rocks. I genuinely hope that in this case, they make the fights extremely exciting with various types of ammunition being used, as well as mobs that have a high level of accuracy and ability against unprepared nomads. I think there should be some really massive battle strategies that go into play when fighting them. We know so far anyway that they'll have different types of siege weapons and a more specific AI capability, which my guess is they will have a very high level of accuracy with things like boulders, so that you can't just cheese the mechanics and actually have them bear the hit. In this post, they mentioned that the Rock Mountain, aka Go-Go, which will be on the Cali Spires map, and there will be smaller versions throughout the outskirts with the giant one sitting in the middle. Their design here is that the giant one will act as a rather large raid boss and require a large group of players to take down, whereas the small ones on the outskirts will be sized more for a stiletto walker with a crew of 4 to 5 people to take on. In both these cases, they want to essentially create a culture of using your walker for battle primarily against these types of creatures for important resources, and expect fights from other nomads to come knocking while you're in the heat of battle with these. Yes, please, yes. That sounds like an incredible direction for the game to go, and exactly what LO needs. I did want to mention, though, that one very important detail you may have missed here when reading it is that, quote, even at its lowest tier, Go-Go will be extremely tough with one of the highest armor ratings in the game. Even at its lowest tier. What does that mean exactly? So there are going to be different tiers of the big, massive world boss that spawns. Does that mean there might be a rarity or quality system in place for it? Perhaps you have a bronze, silver, and gold tier of that mob, which spawns with higher variables of things like damage and health, thus giving you a higher chance at quality resources, like the quality 100 stuff for your walker. I don't know for sure if this is the case just yet, but if it is, I really like the concept of it. The level of variation to these mobs would be really cool, plus you might hear a tier 3 world boss spawned on a specific tile, and everyone throughout the entire world server starts calling in their allies to take it down, since it's such a rare spawn, and now we have a massive battle taking place. They also mention in here that it takes heavy weaponry to pierce the hardest armor class, and requires capital and large walkers to fight it. That tells us a few things. First of all, the hardest armor in the game no longer will require Hellfire bolts, and instead, the tier 3 weapons will also be able to deal damage to them. Second, as I mentioned before, you'll need at least a size large or capital walker to use those tier 3 weapons. They then talk briefly about how they place creatures in specific areas to make the game feel alive, which is what most games do, and that they intend to make these mobs only spawn in those areas. I personally don't care about that idea as much, not because of the immersion aspect, but because I think they should be something surprising. You're trekking through an oasis when suddenly from around the corner an Occam comes blitzing after you. Perhaps that's the cynic in me, but I particularly enjoy the idea of these creatures being threatening and having a chance to appear at any point in the oasis. If I always know to avoid that area, or even worse, if there's a specific leash range, it makes the whole thing a little less exciting because you're then essentially able to control when you want to fight them, and it removes a lot of the survival aspect to things once you become a more experienced player. They also mentioned that they changed the Rupu tribes on Cali Spires a bit, so there's something to keep an eye out for, but likely they just added the oil Rupus or something like that from the custom servers. We then get some new featurettes on 2 new creatures. The first is the Lava Frog and the Mist Frog, aka Papak, which will spawn in the lava map areas and the mushroom areas of medium maps. They explode when they die and always try to attack players from a distance, so my guess is they will be extremely annoying to fight. I'm curious what kinds of resources the frogs will drop, but perhaps they drop things like pearls or chitin or something like that. Maybe they drop lava and mushrooms respectively as well. The Koa has finally been added as well. These creatures were absolutely massive before, so I'm hoping they didn't scale it down too much. It's kind of a giant resource cow that will likely give leather and things like that, but it's also a part of the battle mobs, where Rupus will actually saddle up top and be shooting off of its top platform. Personally, I've said this in my past video, they planned to add a lot more content to the game. But realistically, the Koa has been in the game since launch, and so the frogs are really the only new mob that they've introduced. I know they just redid all the architecture for every single mob, but they really need to up the ante and aim for more than 1 new creature per year being introduced into the game. I could be wrong, and they have a whole lot more that they're still looking to add in but haven't spoken about it, but so far, all we've seen the evidence of, and all that they've shown for the new content is just this. With the AI system changes, as I mentioned, they redid the system itself and gave an example of why. So I'll just pick out the important bits here that I haven't already covered. One thing they mentioned is Chad's reworked all of the AI interacting with walkers. This one is a little fascinating to me because they claim that no other game has done this. So what that tells me is that they were actually looking at having NPCs on the battle mobs able to fight and interact as if it was on your walker, which in my opinion would be an extremely impressive update to the AI, but rather unlikely. Usually when games do this, they simplify things by just making a single entity with a health bar that has a bunch of weapons firing off of it, and when the HP hits 0, the whole thing just shatters and dies. What they may be trying to do here is have individual NPCs interacting with the stations on a battle mob to aim and shoot at player walkers. They could also just have the stations themselves be things like Rupu turrets with a big health bar, and that would be a more simplified version of it. But at least it's still modular on the actual enemy battle mob. What's really cool about this, and segues into the next part, is that they mention that the creatures now recognize what the player is doing and try to react in the environment around it. A very impressive boast for AI in a game. But even further than that, it mentions players wiggling left and right to dodge an attack from a Nur. This is cool because it means that they've reworked Nurs so that you can actually dodge them by moving in some sort of direction. And this also means that they probably have creatures aim at an enemy walker, and to do the math to make sure their ballista shots will have enough lead time to hit that walker, with tier 3 mobs having perfect accuracy. They also mentioned that they reworked the AI to actually stay within the range for attacks, which is kind of nice since they won't be so annoying and that they want the fights to be fun and fair, which I totally agree with. I don't know how much that changes things as fighting large groups of Rupus, and it may still end up being a mosh pit, but we'll see what happens with them. With collisions for Occams and Nurs, he mentions that there's a lot of difficulty regarding creatures that have rigid bodies, aka the ones that your character can stand on top of. A common bug in this case is that you have essentially what happens when two objects collide into each other. If one of them, like a creature, has a specific animation it's doing, it has to carry that whole thing out. If you're underneath an Occam and it stomps on you, your walker then gets displaced somewhere around it. If the game can't recognize the displacement properly, what happens is your walker shakes around wildly and then gets flung into space as it's essentially being displaced so rapidly back to other rigid parts of the creature until it finally breaks free and keeps whatever velocity it breaks free at. They've done a good job at fixing a lot of these types of bugs so far, however, and although I know it's difficult for them to operate in many cases, they have a lot of good work there done already. Battle mobs. What are they? Well, it looks like everything I mentioned previously, but they do say that there will be Rupu on top that throw javelins at you, so you know that they'll have different armor types, and of course they'll have different Rupu versions of catapults. They'll shoot some kind of base weapon or ammunition at players, very similar to the huts on tops of spire maps that shoot floating mines at raptor walkers when they fly too close. With the sandworm, finally for this update they talk about changes to the sandworm. These don't mean much because they mentioned that they're not going to be looking at these changes during Season 5, but they want to make it a harder encounter later on, and I completely agree with that. I hope that they do make it a lot more dangerous for players to fight. I think that they should increase its size by 2 times as big, get rid of raptor walkers fighting it completely, and perhaps change the AI to have more of a direct approach to killing walkers. Also, please make it completely immune to player weapons, of course. Overall, I'm really excited for this next season, and these AI changes are a great thing to hear. I think the reworking of the architecture for things is also a fantastic change, and they've essentially spent the time remaking the core components of the game so that instead of manually building each item and object and creature from the ground up, they can kind of do a copy-paste to the new one and make subtle changes to how they work to add some variety. This works for me, and hopefully we'll see a ton of new content that they're looking to putting out regarding these core concepts. The battle mobs as well are an incredible opportunity to catalyst more walker battles and more clan versus clan content that will happen naturally rather than having one clan roam randomly on a tile for hours hoping that they run into somebody. Next week, they'll be looking at doing a dev blog on siege weapon design, which will entail all of the new tier 1, 2, and 3 weapons that will likely become available to customize on your ship. I would predict that they'll be including some more info on which walkers can utilize each tier of weapon as well. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.